In 1950, Chicago was the second largest city in the United States. It had more than 3.6 million people, a booming industrial economy, and a reputation as one of the most powerful cities in the entire world. Today, that same city has shed over 1 million residents. Entire neighborhoods sit half empty. Businesses have fled. Violence has become its most recognizable export. Not steel, not innovation, not culture. And the strangest part, it didn't have to be this way. Chicago's collapse is not the story of a city that was forgotten. It's the story of a city that was actively dismantled by its own leaders, its own policies, and its own politics. And if you understand what happened to Chicago, you'll understand a pattern that's playing out in cities across America right now. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what Chicago once was. In the early 20th century, this was the city where the American dream felt most tangible. It sat at the center of the country's rail network, a geographic lottery win that made it the undisputed hub of manufacturing, meatpacking, and commerce. Carl Sandburg called it the city of big shoulders, and that wasn't just poetry. It was an industrial machine. The workers poured in, from the American South, from Eastern Europe, from Mexico. Entire communities took root. Neighborhoods like Bronzeville became the black cultural capital of the North. Pilsen became a vibrant Mexican enclave. Bridgeport, Canaryville, back of the yards. Each had their own identity, their own pulse. Chicago, in its prime, was a city of neighborhoods, a mosaic that worked. But somewhere between then and now, something went catastrophically wrong, and it didn't happen overnight. Let's start with the most visible symptom: population loss. Chicago has lost more than 1.2 million residents since 1950. That's not a gentle decline, that's a collapse, and it's not random. The losses have been concentrated almost entirely on the city's south and west sides, the historically black and brown communities that were already the most economically vulnerable. Today, neighborhoods like Englewood, Austin, and Woodlawn have vacancy rates exceeding 20%. In some blocks, you'll find more abandoned buildings than occupied ones. Property values have cratered so badly that entire city blocks have been sold for less than the cost of a used car. And when residents leave, businesses follow. When businesses leave, tax revenue collapses. When revenue collapses, services deteriorate. And when services deteriorate, more people leave. It's a doom loop, and Chicago has been trapped in it for decades. But how did a city this powerful, this strategically located, this deeply resourced, end up here? The answer lies in a series of decisions, each one made with some logic at the time, each one making things progressively worse. The first catastrophic policy was public housing, or rather, the way Chicago did public housing. Starting in the 1940s and accelerating through the 1960s, the Chicago Housing Authority built enormous high-rise housing projects, concentrated almost entirely in black neighborhoods on the south and west sides. The Robert Taylor homes, Cabrini Green, the Harold Ickes homes. At their peak, these towers housed nearly 150,000 people. The political logic was cynical from the start. White aldermen on the north side refused to allow public housing in their wards, so the projects were stacked vertically on land that already existed in segregated neighborhoods. The result was an unprecedented concentration of poverty. When federal funding for maintenance dried up in the 1970s, these towers began to decay. Elevators broke and weren't fixed. Heat failed in winter. Gang activity surged in the stairwells. By the 1990s, the Robert Taylor homes, once the largest public housing complex in the world, was described by the New York Times as one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The city's response was demolition. Between 1995 and 2011, Chicago tore down nearly every major housing project it had built. The plan was called the Plan for Transformation. The promise was that residents would be relocated into mixed-income communities across the city. What actually happened was that tens of thousands of families were scattered with minimal support, many ending up in already stressed neighborhoods on the south and west sides, simply shifting and amplifying the crisis rather than solving it. The second catastrophic factor was deindustrialization, and Chicago's political class was catastrophically slow to respond. As factories shuttered through the 1970s and 80s, the city failed to invest in retraining workers or attracting new industries at scale. Other Rust Belt cities struggled too, but Chicago had the resources and the geographic advantages to pivot faster. It largely didn't. The industrial neighborhoods that once employed hundreds of thousands became wastelands, and the people who lived in them had nowhere to go. The third factor is the one most people talk about last: corruption. Chicago has a corruption problem so embedded in its culture that it's almost treated as a personality trait. Since 1973, more than 1,500 Chicago public officials have been convicted of federal corruption charges. That is not a typo. Aldermen took bribes to approve zoning changes, city contracts went to politically connected firms, tax increment financing districts, a tool meant to revitalize blighted areas, were routinely redirected to pet projects that benefited donors. The money that should have rebuilt struggling neighborhoods was being siphoned out of the city's future. Take the story of the city's school system. In 2013, Mayor Rahm Emanuel closed 50 public schools in a single year, the largest mass school closure in American history. The rationale was fiscal. Enrollment had dropped as population declined, and the schools were operating at a fraction of their capacity. But the schools that were closed were overwhelmingly on the south and west sides, overwhelmingly black. The children forced to transfer often had to cross gang territory lines to reach their new schools. Violence around those transit routes spiked. The closures didn't save the city money in any meaningful long-term way. What they did do was accelerate the sense that certain communities simply didn't matter. Or take the pension crisis. Chicago owes its public employees, police, firefighters, teachers, municipal workers, over $35 billion in pension obligations that it has chronically underfunded for decades. Every year the city doesn't pay what it owes, the gap grows. Today, nearly a third of Chicago's property tax revenue goes directly to pension payments, money that can't be spent on parks, infrastructure, or economic development. It is a structural death spiral baked into the city's finances, and there is no painless way out. The human cost of all this is staggering. Chicago consistently ranks among the most violent major cities in America. In 2021, the city recorded over 800 homicides, a number that would be unconscionable in most developed nations for a city of any size. The violence is almost entirely concentrated in those same South and West Side neighborhoods, the same ones gutted by failed housing policy, deindustrialization, and fiscal neglect. The economic impact extends far beyond the city limits. Illinois state finances are deeply intertwined with Chicago's. The city's fiscal instability has contributed to Illinois having one of the worst credit ratings of any state in the country, raising borrowing costs for every public project in the state. And the people who leave take wealth with them. Studies show that when middle-class families exit a declining city, they don't just take their incomes. They take their social networks, their institutional knowledge, their civic engagement. The communities left behind become progressively harder to rebuild. Chicago matters not just because of its size, but because of what it represents. It is a case study in what happens when urban policy fails at every level simultaneously, when housing becomes a tool of segregation rather than shelter, when industrial decline goes unaddressed, when public finances are treated as a piggy bank by the politically connected, when the most vulnerable communities are considered expendable. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Chicago's not unique. The same patterns, concentrated poverty, deindustrialization, corrupt political machines, pension crises, are playing out in Detroit, St. Louis, Baltimore, and a dozen other American cities. Chicago is just the largest and most visible example. Understanding what happened there is a prerequisite for understanding what's coming everywhere else. There are signs of life. The tech sector has taken root in the Fulton Market District on the near west side, attracting companies like Google and McDonald's headquarters. Neighborhood organizations in communities like North Lawndale and Woodlawn have launched ambitious community land trust programs designed to stabilize housing without displacement. A new generation of civic leaders is trying to rethink policing, economic development, and housing simultaneously, but the structural problems, the pension debt, the deeply embedded inequality, the political culture of corruption, are not things that inspirational leadership can fix quickly. Analysts estimate that fully closing Chicago's pension gap at current trajectories would require tax increases or service cuts so painful that they would drive away even more residents and businesses, accelerating the very spiral the city is trying to escape. Chicago didn't fall apart because of one bad mayor or one bad decision. It fell apart because of decades of choices to segregate, choices to neglect, choices to steal, choices to ignore. The concrete and steel are still there. The lakefront is still one of the most beautiful urban landscapes in the world. The cultural institutions, the Art Institute, the Chicago Symphony, the architecture, remain world-class. But a city isn't its skyline, it's its people, its neighborhoods, its promise. And for hundreds of thousands of Chicagoans, that promise was broken long ago. Whether it can be rebuilt is the defining question of the city's next chapter, And the honest answer right now is nobody knows.